Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim wa bihi nasta'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody, and assalamu alaikum to the birds. Beep, 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 beep. Today I want to talk about more of a concept, a more conceptual based video. I want to talk about democracy. Democracy, that system which is taken for granted in our world today, that system which is presumed to be good, with no question or objection. To the extent that every country in the world except for 6, which I'll flash on the screen, which 6, claim to be democracies. Whether they're actually democracies or not is besides the point. It's relevant enough that they insist and they deem it important to be deemed as democracies. In fact, you look at probably the least democratic country in the world, North Korea. The official name of North Korea is the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, of Korea, and DPRK. And Curtis Yarvin humorously points out that the sun just went out, but he points out that these are 3 synonyms for democracy: democratic, people's, republic. It's all basically yes, 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 we are democracy, but why? Why is democracy just good? And this is what I want to speak with you guys about today. And the critics of democracy begin with the advocates of democracy themselves. When people like Winston Churchill say that democracy is the worst system in the world except for all the others, what a glowing recommendation from one of democracy's most famous proponents, one of the most famous heads of state in a democratic system. So let's begin with Churchill's own argument against democracy, which, as he says, is the 5-minute conversation with the average voter. This, according to Churchill, is the best argument against democracy. And that, in summary, is mob rule. You see, the Enlightenment thinkers had this brilliant idea that we should take legislation out of the hands of the nobility and the kings and give it to the peasants. I mean, if the nobles couldn't figure it out, what makes you think that the peasants can? I know where it comes from. It comes from this idea that because the kings subjugated the people should be liberated. The people should be free to legislate and be put in charge really through their representatives, and that would free them. That would free them from the yoke of monarchical feudal repression. Now, before we get to that point, let's just stick with the point of legislation and statecraft is not some easy thing. It's not just about like you have a say. It's about, what do you have to say, my friend? How are you going to legislate? How are you going to set economic systems? How are you going to manage foreign affairs and diplomacy? This is not something that should be left to a popularity contest, right? When in democracies, heads of states are incentivized to legislate and rule according to that which is popular, and what is popular is not based on an understanding of how these sciences of statecraft actually work. So that one is probably pretty simple for you guys. You've probably heard that critique before. Let's move on to the second point, which is really the point that democracy makes for itself, which is that, again, it liberates us by giving us all a say. Now, there's a few problems with this idea that we all have a say. The first one is that even in the ideal case when, yes, all of us independent citizens of a democracy have a say, that doesn't preclude what we might call mob tyranny, or the tyranny of the majority. When 51% or more than 50% of the country wants to subjugate the remaining less than 50%. And we saw this. We saw this, for example, in the Japanese internment during World War II, when most of the country was fine with the Japanese minority in World War II being treated as a fifth column. And more broadly speaking, in the United States, race relations between white people and black people. You even had a violation of the tenets of democracy itself when the black people were given that 3/5 compromise, and before that not even allowed to vote. So we saw, time and time again in the United States, democracy does not free us from the tyranny of the majority, right? People in a society exist in certain kinds of blocks. There's the rich people and there's the poor people, there's the white people, there's the black people, there's the business owners, there's the employees, and between all of these factions, we can get kind of unions between these factions to assert their rights, to assert their privileges, to assert their interests. Really, that's the right word. To assert their interests at the expense of others. That's really how democracy works. And that's what lobbying is. Lobbying is an elite minority or a faction that is organized to achieve its own interests through the democratic process at the expense of the rest of society, even if, now we're moving on to the next point, even if they're not the majority. And that takes us to point number 3 now. Point number 1 was, the peasants can't rule. I know that's kind of a mean way to say it. Point number 2 is that the majority can still be a tyranny, right? This idea that democracy frees us by giving us a say, well, unless you're not in the majority, right? Or unless unless you're in, what's the word? Unless you're in the minority. Yeah, sorry, late day. And now point number 3, which is that the elite in society, the elite in democratic society, have an outsized influence on the outcome of democratic processes. This occurs, like I mentioned, through corporate lobbying, lobbying the governments and congressmen, because at the end of the day, these people need to be elected. They need campaign war chests, lots of money to compete in the election, on the media, and so forth. So you can think of each elected official as like a joint stock company, where each person that invests, that lobbies that person, has a share in his administration. Because once you're elected, because the oil lobby gave you the money and gave you the connections, and it aligned the factions that are aligned with it to vote for you and to come out for you, once that happens, you owe them something back once you're elected. Otherwise, you're going to be a pariah. You're not going to be supported by anybody, not just that oil company that you burned, but everybody's going to see that you're not somebody who plays ball, right? So not only that, but even if even for the rest of your term, people are not going to cooperate with you. You're not going to have people that are going to help you to carry out your mandate as an elected official without those people who bought into you. Okay, so that's the next. That's just the lobbying issue. Moreover to that, a Yale study in 2014 found that the United States is actually an oligarchy, because they found that public policy had zero correlation with public opinion. It's like a flat curve with public opinion and public policy. But however, when you compare elite opinion, rich opinion, with public policy, there is a strong correlation. So the conclusion of that study is that, look, the United States nominally is a democracy, but functions really more closely to an oligarchy, where the rich and the connected and the elite are the ones who have a say on public policy. One more sub-point on this point is that elite people who own media enterprises, who own businesses, who have the wealth, they are uniquely and privilegedly, if that's a word, positioned to influence public opinion itself. And this is the biggest black pill of all. That we as individual citizens in a democracy, we're not as free in our own thinking as we think we are. The idea that if you give a human being freedom, he will leverage that at its fullest extent. He will become well educated, he'll become well disciplined, and he will leverage all of that freedom and channel all of that freedom into a productive enterprise. That's just not true. You look at the streets of America and you see what total individual freedom looks like. It looks like an opioid addiction. So when people like to sing the slogans of freedom, I just think about what freedom really looks like to the normal person. They need to be free from freedom, to be very frank. I know that's a very black-pilling statement, but this is why Islam frees a human being from slavery, not only to others, but slavery to himself, to his own desires. And because of a human being's desires, all what democracy is elite rule with one extra step, and that extra step is just influencing the public opinion, using the resources that you have, buying and selling the population. Manufacturing consent, as Noam Chomsky calls it, right? Human beings are highly manipulable, and using what they care about, using their material interests and desires, and herd opinion and groupthink. There are lots of ways to leverage the emotions of the people also, to add to that list, to get them on board with whatever policy position the country wants to push forward, or a faction of elites wants to push forward. So there goes public opinion. Here's another problem with democracies. Because of their term limits, heads of states and parties, political parties, are incentivized to sabotage the country for the next party that comes into power, right? Because a party's objective is not what's best for the country. A party's objective is to stay in power. Sometimes that aligns with what's best with the country, and oftentimes it doesn't. Oftentimes it means you need the country to go bad so that you can blame it on your political opponent. Right? If it's your last term, or let's say like your last few months in office, there are measures that you can take to kind of stonewall, sabotage, the incoming party the opposition party that's gonna come into power, so that next election you can basically blame them for everything that they did, right? So this kind of cynical relationship between the political parties in the country is another issue with democracy. Let's talk about more issues with democracy. Democracies, because they at least have to care about everybody's say, tend to be incredibly inefficient and incredibly sluggish. You know, an Islamic system which places one man at the top who has to legislate by God's law, but that's a different story, we're going to get to that. That Khalifa, once he's elected by the people, see, elections are not necessarily democracy, and we're going to get to that too. Once the Khalifa is elected by the people, he rules for life. And he is pretty close to having dictatorial powers within the Islamic constitution. And so he can function really as an executive. He can function like a CEO would in a company, you know, held back by a board of directors in case, you know, he starts going haywire, he starts to violate the constitution of the country, of the Islamic State. But within that mandate, he can move fast. He can make orders that are carried out with religious subordination to the rule of the Khalifa, as the Quran tells us, وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولَ وَأُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْكُمْ, right? As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, obey the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and those who are placed in authority from amongst you. For us, obedience to the authority is something that's part of the deen, as long as obedience to the authority is not in disobedience of the Creator. So that's something that Madkhalis get confused about. No, I just kind of introduced like 10 different things that people would easily become confused about. So let's kind of get into the Islamic solution. The Islamic solution addresses these problems with democracy in a few ways. Number one, we don't rely on any human being to legislate, right? Neither kings, nor nobles, nor peasants, nor CEOs, nor pharaohs are fit to legislate. We avoid the tyrannies of majorities and minorities, and we avoid the lack of qualification for the science of statecraft, for the science of legislation, by giving all of that to God. In Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only legislator. Very few people understand this. Actually, they become incredulous when you tell them that God is the only legislator, because the first thing is like, oh, what Islam's a religion? Oh, what do prayers have to do with the economic system? That's exactly what the people of Shu'aib said. They asked him, oh Shu'aib, do your prayers forbid us from worshipping what our fathers worshipped and from doing with our money what we please? Meaning how they used to cheat in their economic system that Shu'aib was warning them against. So we, as Muslims, as human beings with common sense, to be very frank, understand that the creator of the universe is the only fit king, legislator of the universe, of the human being. And so we are all equally slaves. We are all equally having no say in legislation. And governance in Islam becomes relegated to the task of interpreting the legislation according to the rules of Islam. Interpretation is not just willy-nilly and free-for-all. There is interpretation. There is a range of acceptable, valid opinions of the Sharia. However, that is done according to rules, and people can point out those rules. And not all of Islam is open to interpretation. There's the qat'i aspects which are not open to interpretation. Those are the core of the deen. And then there are the dhanni aspects which are have a valid range of interpretation. They're also not a free-for-all. So governance is about interpretation and implementation. That's the chief feature, right? The government, the Khalifa, his job is to implement God's law as he understood it from the Quran and Sunnah. He's merely a custodian of the law that was revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and preserved and interpreted by the scholars that came after him sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we avoid that issue too. Since the Khalifa rules for life, we avoid this issue of sabotage, as I mentioned before, of alignment of the country's interests, of the people's interests with the ruling party's interests, because the party does not have to worry about re-election. There is, because the Khalifa rules until death, when that death happens, then an election can happen. And yes, elections do happen. You see, democracy, I should have started with a definition of democracy. Maybe I'll define democracy now and I'll put it back in later, but democracy is defined as the right of legislation is just distributed to the people, all the people. right? Legislation, right? Not the right to choose the leader, because Islam gives us the right. This is the opinion of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Islam gives the people the right to choose their Khalifa, to choose their leader. And once they do so, that leader is bound by the Islamic Constitution, which is the Quran, which tells him that legislation is only for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to look for legislation in the Quran and Sunnah, right? So that's the difference. There's a difference between rulership, which in Islam is elected, and legislation, which in Islam is only for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, okay? Whereas in democracy, both rulership and legislation is for the people, right? Usually through representatives, because direct democracy is not very feasible. So what else did we not address? We talked about the tyranny of the majority and the tyranny of the minority, because Islam removes legislation from any human being's purview. So nobody has the right to weaponize legislation to enrich themselves, to enrich their tribe, to enrich their cronies at the expense of others. The second thing that we mentioned, or I'm kind of going out of order now, we talked about the qualification, the capability of human beings to legislate. One is the bias and the drive of human beings to subjugate each other. The other is the mere qualification, the mere knowledge and competence to be able to do such a task efficiently and effectively. And that, of course, is not with human beings, because legislation is an extraordinarily complex task. And for us to turn the world into a laboratory like they did in the 20th century with all those Nazism and communism and capitalism, and to turn the world into a lab of your own ideology and to try this out on human beings is just unjust and disgusting. This experimentation, political science is not much science here, right? Political philosophy, at least. So really, Islam says, look, leave this for the Creator, because the Creator is the one who has the right and who has the ability. And we talked about also, so the whole point about manufacturing public consent and lobbying public officials, all of that goes out the window in an Islamic system, because again, the law comes from God. Now, of course, human beings are the ones who are at the helm of this system, right? On this world, at the end of the day, it comes down to human beings to make the decisions and to be upright and to be principled. So yes, things can still go wrong within an Islamic system. But the key aspect here is that we have a uniform barometer, a uniform standard for holding our leaders to account, which is the Quran and Sunnah. Any Muslim can look at the Quran and Sunnah and see what did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say, what did His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam say, and hold his leaders accountable, right? There's no such, universality, except, okay, the American Constitution, which is limited in its scope, but, a congressman legislating on oil laws or environmental laws or employment law, this is not something that is enshrined in some foundational document. This is something that democracy says that the people should be able to decide. And due to that vagueness in democracy, and due to the manipulability of the people, certain people can get their interests through. Islam, it was revealed by God to His Messenger. Nobody now has the opportunity to push their interests through the legislation. Right? There's still opportunities for them to try to push their interests through in other means, but the legislation, which is the underlying foundation of society, is protected. I think that's enough for now. We've compared the Khilafah system to democracy, and we talked about some of the issues. This was kind of a very introductory lesson. I don't know what the heck this is. Introductory video on some of the flaws of democracy. Maybe I'll make some more advanced videos coming up. Some of the stuff you might have heard already, but stay tuned for more discussions of competing systems in the world with regards to governance and political philosophy. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.